It was a beautiful morning on the island of Sodor. Thomas the tank engine's blue paint sparkled in the sunshine as he puffed happily along his branch line with Annie and Clarabelle. He was feeling very pleased with himself. "Hello, Thomas," whistled Percy. "You look splendid." "Yes, indeed," boasted Thomas. "Blue is the only proper color for an engine." "Oh, I don't know. I like my brown paint," said Toby. "I've always been green. I wouldn't want to be any other color either," added Percy. Well, anyway, huffed Thomas, "blue is the only color for a really useful engine. Everyone knows that." Percy said no more. He just grinned at Toby. Later, Thomas was resting when Percy arrived. A large hopper was loading his trucks full of coal. Thomas was still being cheeky. "Careful," he warned. "Watch out with those silly trucks." Go on, muttered the trucks. "And by the way," went on Thomas, "those buffers don't look very safe to me." The last load poured down. "Help! I'm choking!" cried Thomas. "Get me out!" Percy was worried, but he couldn't help laughing. Thomas's smart blue paint was covered in coal dust from smoke box to bunker. "Ha ha," chuckled Percy. "You don't look really useful now, Thomas. You look really disgraceful." "I'm not disgraceful," choked Thomas. "You did that on purpose. Get me out." It took so long to clean Thomas that he wasn't in time for his next train. Toby had to take Annie and Clarabelle. "Poor Thomas," whispered Annie to Clarabelle. They were most upset. Thomas was grumpy in the shed that night. Toby thought it a great joke, but Percy was cross with Thomas for thinking he had made his paint dirty on purpose. Fancy a really useful blue engine like Thomas becoming a disgrace to the Fat Controller's railway. Next day, Thomas was feeling more cheerful as he watched Percy bring his trucks from the junction. The trucks were heavy and Percy was tired. "Have a drink," said his driver, "then you'll feel better." The water column stood at the end of the siding with the unsafe buffers. Suddenly, Percy found that he couldn't stop. The buffers didn't stop him either. "Oh!" wailed Percy. "Help!" The buffers were broken and Percy was wheel-deep in coal. It was time for Thomas to leave. He had seen everything. "Now Percy has learned his lesson too," he chuckled to himself. That night, the two engines made up their quarrel. "I didn't cause your accident on purpose, Thomas," whispered Percy. "You do know that, don't you?" "Of course," replied Thomas, "and I'm sorry I was cheeky. Your green paint looks splendid again, too. In future, we'll both be more careful of coal."
Saving Edward. It was summertime on the island of Sodor. All the engines were working hard, carrying goods and passengers. They cheerfully chuffed up and down the lines. All except Edward. Edward was worried. He wheezed as he puffed, and steam hissed out of his cylinders. One morning, Sir Topham Hatt came to the sheds. He had an important job for Edward. "A special delivery of fruit and vegetables is coming to the docks today," he told him. "I want you to take it to Knapford." "Yes, sir," said Edward, but he was worried about his wheeze. It felt worse today. "Thomas, you ought to go to the docks and shunt Edward's freight cars. After that, you can carry on with your usual jobs." "Yes, sir," said Thomas eagerly. Thomas and Edward puffed to the water tower. Edward tried to stop wheezing, but he couldn't. "What's the matter?" asked Thomas. "You don't sound well." "I can't seem to get up steam properly," said Edward. "But I'll manage. Don't tell anyone, Thomas." Thomas wasn't sure about this. "I don't want Sir Topham Hatt to know," hissed Edward. Thomas could see Edward was worried, so he agreed. He hurried off to shunt Edward's freight cars. Edward followed slowly to the docks. Edward was very worried. What if he was too weak to pull his train? He would be of no use to the railway. He wouldn't be useful at all. Edward shuddered at the thought. "Must keep going, must keep going," he wheezed fearfully. At the docks, Thomas had shunted Edward's freight cars into place for him. Soon, Edward was coupled up and ready to go. "Go on, Edward, you can do it," called Thomas encouragingly. Edward puffed as hard as he could, but the train hardly moved at all. "I'm sorry, Thomas," Edward wheezed miserably. "I'm not a really useful engine anymore. Sir Topham Hatt will have to send me for scrap." Thomas was very upset. He wanted to help Edward. "I'll do my other jobs first," Thomas said. "Then I'll pull the train for you." Edward watched Thomas puff away. He wasn't sure if it was right to let Thomas do his job. Edward felt very worried. Thomas needed to do all his jobs as quickly as possible so that he had time to pull Edward's train. Hurry up, he told the troublesome trucks. "What for? What for?" they snapped. "For Edward," puffed Thomas, and he biffed them crossly. Edward waited sadly by his train. He hoped Thomas would come back soon. When Thomas finished all his jobs, he puffed back to collect Edward's train. Edward was very pleased to see him. "Don't worry, Edward," puffed Thomas. "I'll have your job done in no time. You go back to Tidmouth and I'll meet you there later." "Thank you, Thomas," wheezed Edward. And Thomas pulled away with a long line of freight cars. Thomas was tired. He had been working all day, and Edward's train was very heavy. But he was determined not to let Edward down. Sir Topham Hatt was talking to Gordon as Thomas puffed in. "Thomas, this train is late," he said crossly. "And why are you pulling it? Where is Edward?" Thomas didn't want to get Edward into trouble. He had to think of an excuse. Edward took on the wrong sort of coal, sir." "The wrong sort of coal?" boomed Sir Topham Hatt. "What nonsense, Thomas! I'll find out what Edward has to say about this later." Sir Topham Hatt was very cross. He gave Thomas another job to do. "Yes, sir," said Thomas. Gordon steamed through the countryside. And then he found Edward having a rest. "What's all this about the wrong sort of coal?" huffed Gordon. Edward looked puzzled. "The wrong sort of coal?" Gordon told Edward all about Thomas and Sir Topham Hatt. Edward felt very bad. He wanted to put things right. He decided he must go and see Sir Topham Hatt straight away. Edward hissed and wheezed his way to the station. His fire felt feeble. His wheels felt weak, but he battled on. At last, Edward puffed into the station. He found Sir Topham Hatt. "It's all my fault, sir," he said sadly. "I asked Thomas not to tell you I couldn't work. I was afraid of going for scrap. I'm very sorry. I should have talked to you this morning." "You should always tell me if you have a problem," said Sir Topham Hatt. "You are a loyal, hard-working, and really useful engine. I will send you to the fitters' yard straight away. You'll soon be as good as new." Edward was very relieved, and Thomas was very tired from his extra work, but they both agreed, even when it's hard, it's always best to tell the truth.
One winter evening, Henry's driver said, "We'll be out early tomorrow. We've got to take the flying kipper. Don't tell Gordon, but I think if we pull the kipper nicely, Sir Topham Hatt will let us pull the express. The special coal they gave you is working well." "Hooray!" cried Henry. "That will be lovely." All kinds of ships use the harbor at the big station by the sea. There are passenger ships, cargo ships, and fishing boats also come here. They unload their fish on the quay. Some of it goes to shops in the town, and the rest in a special train to other places far away. This is the train the railwaymen call the Flying Kipper. Henry was ready at 5 o'clock. There was snow and frost. Men hustled and shouted, loading up the crates of fish. The last door banged, the guard showed his green lamp, and the Flying Kipper was ready to go. Come on, don't be silly, puffed Henry to the freight cars. The cars shuddered and groaned. Trickety-trock, all right. That's better, puffed Henry. Clouds of smoke and steam poured from his funnel into the cold air, and the fire's light shone brightly. Hurry, panted Henry. They were going well. The light grew better. Signal lights shone green as they passed. Then a yellow signal appeared ahead. His driver prepared to stop, but the home signal was down. All clear, Henry. Away we go. They couldn't know the switches from the main line to a siding were frozen, and the home signal should have been set at danger, but snow had forced it down. A freight train was waiting in the siding to let the Flying Kipper pass, and the driver and fireman were drinking cocoa in the caboose. "The Kipper is due," said the conductor. "Who cares?" said the fireman. "This is good cocoa." The driver got up. "Come on, fireman, back to our engine." They got out just in time. Henry's driver and fireman had jumped clear before the crash, but Henry lay dazed and surprised. Sir Topham Hatt came to see him. "The signal was down, sir," said Henry. "Cheer up, Henry. It wasn't your fault. Ice and snow caused the accident. I'm sending you to Crew, a fine place for sick engines. They'll give you a new shape and a larger firebox. You'll feel a different engine, and you won't need special coal anymore. Won't that be nice? Yes, sir, said Henry, doubtfully. Henry liked being at Crew, but was glad to come home. A crowd of people waited to see him arrive in his new shape. He looked so splendid and strong that they gave him 3 cheers. Beep, beep, he whistled. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to say that a lot of little children are often late for school because they wait to see Henry go by. They often see him pulling the express. He does it so well that Gordon is jealous. But that's another story.
Gordon the big engine and Thomas the tank engine puffed buffer to buffer back home. It had been a busy day. First, Thomas had teased Gordon about the time that the big engine had slid into a ditch. Then Thomas fell down a mine and Gordon came to his rescue. "Remember, Thomas," called Gordon grandly, "united we stand, together we fall. You help me and I'll help you." "I'll remember," replied Thomas, "but I hope Sir Topham Hatt forgives us soon." Suddenly they noticed something. As the 2 engines whistled into the sheds, everywhere they looked, they saw paint pots and painters. "Bust my buffers," said Thomas. "What's happening?" "Shh," whispered Percy. "Sir Topham Hatt's going to tell us now. Ladies and gentlemen and engines, I am honored to inform you that Her Majesty the Queen herself is coming here to visit us. Now, on with the preparations." The engines wondered who would pull the royal train. "I'm too old to pull important trains," said Edward. "I'm in disgrace," sighed Gordon. "He'll choose me, of course," boasted James. "You," snorted Henry, "you can't climb hills." "He will ask me to pull the train, and I'll have a new coat of paint." Then the rain came. Henry's driver and fireman covered up their cab to keep dry. A painter was on the ladder above the line. Henry's smoke blew high into the air. The painter couldn't see. Both he and the paint pot fell all over Henry. Poor Henry. "Well, you're not a pretty picture," sneered the painter. Sir Topham Hatt spoke next. "You look like an iced cake, Henry. That won't do for the royal train. I must make other arrangements." Gordon and Thomas were waiting for him. Please, sir. "One at a time," replied Sir Topham Hatt. "Yes, Gordon?" "May Thomas have his branch line again?" "I think you are both sorry and deserve a treat. Edward will go in front to clear the line. Thomas will look after the coaches, and Gordon will pull the train." The great day came. All the engines worked hard, bringing people to the town. Thomas sorted out their coaches in the yard. Edward steamed in. "Beep! The Queen is here!" Then Gordon whistled as he approached the station. Everyone knew that sound. The Queen's train glided into the station. Gordon was spotless and his brass shone brightly. Sir Topham Hatt stood to attention. Welcome, ma'am. The Queen thanked him for a splendid run and asked to see all the engines. Beep, beep, whistled Toby and Percy. Shh, hissed Henry and James. But Toby and Percy didn't care. 3 cheers for the Queen! Beep, beep, whistled the engines. When it was time to leave, the Queen spoke specially to Thomas, who fetched her coaches, then to Edward, and finally to Gordon, who took her away. No engines ever felt prouder than those on Sir Topham Hatt's railway.